All right. So, tacit bargaining and cyber war. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. Cyber conflict, I should say, but it's not as catchy a title. So, persistent engagement and tacit bargaining. If you read the recent book on persistent engagement, where two of the authors of this 2018 article on Lawfare have gone into great depth and tried to explain everything around it in some cogence to you, then you may have read the chapter on tacit bargaining. You may have watched my previous video where I mentioned tacit bargaining and thought that perhaps there were other paths forward, that maybe these things weren't as connected as it was portrayed. And if you do remember this article, A Path Toward Constructing Norms in Cyberspace, I guess one of the first things you probably thought is, well, why? Why did they write this article, right? So that's one of the things I thought. And in some senses, if you view the policy world as sort of an ongoing debate between people who understand persistent engagement and people who want to cling to the remnants of what's left of deterrence theory, and whatever we're calling it these days, layered deterrence, whatever you feel like calling it. Sometimes you got to sort of like lure people in. You got to say like, hey, if you get on board with our new theory, maybe you'll get the norms that you're looking for, right? So you got to lure them in. I don't know if that's the case here, but like it may also be the case that like examining these concepts is very useful for sharpening the theories behind persistent engagement. We may never know, but largely here's where we're at. I want to dive into this a little bit because I don't think that many people read and understood this paper, but I think also people would sort of can read a whole book and just become overwhelmed. And sometimes it's good to do a little slice of it and kind of figure out how it all relates. So let's talk. First of all, the term tacit bargaining, and what is the opposite of tacit bargaining? The opposite of tacit bargaining is the State Department, right? So if we just get a little segment out of this Lawfare paper, all that stuff's going to be linked below. I'm actually going to link a huge document of stuff below, so you can click down there, click on the document, and then just see all of my notes, which is kind of how these videos are made. Okay, so the shift in strategic orientation can be complemented if another bedrock conceptual frame is also reoriented. Establishing cyber norms. If you've been in this world looking at cyber policy, which you probably have been if you're watching this video, then he doesn't have to tell you that the past 4 U.S. administrations have constantly badgered on about establishing cyber norms. If you read the Cyberspace Solarium document, constantly hearing about cyber norms. If you are on Twitter, God forbid, you're hearing about cyber norms, right? So that's the thing. The core idea is to find consensus among like-minded states about acceptable and unacceptable cyber behavior. We want to talk about it. We want to be able to articulate it. And then we want to sort of force everyone else to live by that rule, right? So just like in kindergarten, right? No one throws their milk at each other. That's the theory. Because then we all live in a milky, milky world. Not great. Okay, so the problem is this doesn't seem to be working. So UNGGE, when this paper was written, UNGGE was an abject failure. Now the UNGGE has a signed document which itself is an abject failure. So we've made a small step forward. But I think it was pretty clear to everybody that we weren't getting real value out of traditional diplomacy agreements and arms control agreements and that sort of thing that possibly we were expecting, the same way we expected it in nuclear and in conventional weaponry, right? So we weren't getting what we were expecting. So this is an example of trying to explain that using a new paradigm. Okay, so the big statement here, obviously, norms around acceptable cyber operations can be constructed through behavioral interactions over time if, and only if, the United States reorients its policy toward a process of tacit bargaining. Okay, so now you're thinking, well, what's tacit bargaining, right? Hopefully you're thinking that because you're a creative and interested individual. So, okay, let's go into it. Tacit bargaining. And you're not going to read any paper in this space without hearing about Thomas Schelling. I think his name is very funny when we're talking about cyber war, by the way. Anyway, so Thomas Schelling back in 1960, and keep in mind, some of this stuff is pretty recent. So you're going to see a lot of discussion of papers that are in the 1950s and 60s in sort of an attempt to understand and get over the tragedy of World War II. But then you're also going to see just a number of papers in the 80s and 90s where people start going into bargaining and game theory and stuff like that. So I'm going to have references to a lot of these below, but just keep in mind about the time period. Like, some of this stuff is fairly recent. Some of the stuff comes from the sort of 60s. Okay, so Thomas Schelling recognized that in environments of uncertainty concerning new military technology, deep mutual distrust, states sometimes come to agreements, essentially. And these agreements have the job of getting rid of escalation. But I also want to point out that a lot of the theories that this stuff was targeted to were, because of World War II, obviously nuclear weaponry, conventional warfare, right? So that's kind of where this comes from. The work that you're seeing out of tacit bargaining and cyber from this paper is trying to bridge that gap and bring it into the cyber age, shall we say. So a tacit bargaining process diverges from explicit bargaining in that informal agreements are arrived at not by verbal bargaining, aka not by anybody at the State Department, but by maneuver, by actions and by statements and declarations that are not direct communication to the enemy. Each side tends to act in some kind of recognizable pattern so that any limits that it is actually observing can be appreciated by the enemy. And then each tries to perceive what restraints the other is observing. So I think we're going to talk a little bit about that as we go through, right? So this is like you and your brother are hitting each other, but you both know not to hit in the face. Why? I don't know. You just figured it out as you were hitting each other, right? All right, conflict and common interest. So in order to give you this talk, I went back and I read the original Schelling book, essentially. It's a really big book. Actually, it's a really easy read in comparison to a lot of other literature. You'll find this is actually true. A lot of the earlier literature is a much easier read in general, right? So if you're reading papers from like the 70s or whatever, you're going to find that they're just, I'm not going to say they're better written, but they're more simply written. So you'll notice that. Like, don't be afraid to go back in time on a lot of this stuff. So what did Schelling talk about, right? So Schelling talked about limited war, and how do people without the ability to communicate come to agreements, right? So the classic example is if two people land in New York City and they don't have cell phones, where do they go to hang out? And the answer was, like, you go to the Empire State Building, or you go to, a big statue that you both know about, or you go to your work, or you go to your house. Like, you have, like, in your head, you have, like, probably 5 or 6 places where you're like, we could meet here if neither one of us can communicate, right? So some of these examples don't hold up as much today when you can just ask your neighbor for an email address and send an email, but whatever. The same thing's true in a lot of spheres. There are like these focal points where people will find common interest. And I want to back it up a bit and ask, why are you studying international relations in the first place, right? So if you're watching this video, why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? So presumably you want to understand and influence and change the system of the world, right? Like, a lot of people who study international relations are doing it because they want to make the world a better place, and they've been around a little bit, and they're like, whoa, some stuff is messed up, right? So, like, I get it, right? And then if you're maybe a little bit more nationalistic, you're like, we need to succeed at this, or else our system will fail, and we won't be as well off as we are. So that's another reasons. And then if you're looking at it in terms of pure understanding, you may simply enjoy understanding large systems, right? So that's another possibility. Um, and what I want to point out is that sometimes the mechanism for understanding a process is really not that useful for influence. And one of the core sins of our cyber policy papers community is that it's almost mandatory to have a policy suggestion section at the end of your paper. Very few papers are about the process without having some mechanism to manipulate the process. And those should really be 2 papers, right? So we'll get into it. Let's talk about norms and the history of norms. Because if you're saying that tacit bargaining in cyber is going to produce norms, you have to at some point talk about what norms even are. Okay, so it goes pretty bad. It goes into a sense, it goes deeply into nonsense. Let's just put it that way. So you have, just as you have in any other area, you have sort of these schisms. You know, it's almost like the smaller the stakes, the bigger the acerbic papers. Between sort of liberalism, neoliberalism, constructivism, or they call social constructivism, and the idea of like some of these things, like with liberalism, almost like guns, germs, and steel. They're like, this stuff is determined by economics and economics theory, and you just have to use states. You know, there's realism, which had states only, right? Like so, constructivism, which is where norms are really pushed forward a lot, is that you know you don't have to simply talk about this stuff in economic measures, but we're going to be talking about it in a discussion of sort of almost much broader sense of, you know, sociology, shall we say, right? Like people can have much more detailed interactions than simply tribally, you're better than me in terms of your economic power, right? So there's been a ton of work on what is a norm, how do they evolve, how do they get created, and this is from a different paper, obviously, but I love the phrase, despite many years of focus on this topic, scholars have yet to come to a complete understanding of how or why norms emerge. Of course not, because there's not going to be a complete understanding of how 2 people come to various agreements or 2 countries come to various agreements. So, you know, and everyone's going to redefine what an actor is in this case. So look, there is an aspect of asking yourself, is a norm in cyberspace the same as a norm somewhere else, that I think you should start with if you're going to say tacit bargaining in cyber will help create norms the same way it does in other domains. So that's like a good first start. We should look into that first, and we're going to assume that you've agreed that they can exist. All right. So again, those papers all linked below. Clicky. After you subscribe, obviously, so that I can get my 4 cents per view. So norms, obviously, everyone wants to talk about norms, but and the reason people want to talk about norms is because they want their norms, right? They're not saying, let's talk about norms because I'm willing to give ground. That's never happened. So I think everyone's pushing their own norms, and that is a very fun part of the process. So in that sense, norms are basically cover for might makes right, and you know you'll notice that as you go forward. Anyway, so there's a little long history to it that you could start with, but some of that just delves into nonsense pretty quick, right? Like, I'm going to be honest about the international relations literature in that it's not a harsh criticism to say that when you start reaching into weird levels of philosophy that you've just gone too far. Because we're not here to like we want to understand and influence and change the system of the world. We're not here to bloviate. Let's put it that way. So, all right. Norms around acceptable cyber operations, this is from the original paper on lawfare, can be constructed through behavioral interactions over time if the United States reorients its policy toward a process of tacit bargaining. This is the thesis of that paper, and also the thesis of a chapter in the book. This is what we're really here to analyze, right? So, accepting that norms are a thing that both we and the Russians agree exist, And I know the Russian policy team watches these videos, so please comment below. Let us know if you like it. But you also have to, look, even if they comment and say, yeah, we're totally on board with norms, totally. Norms are totally a thing. Like, you also have to trust that once there is a norm, like, there has to be mutual trust around norms, right? So that's a thing as well. But we're gonna say, for the purposes of analyzing this paper, yes, we agree that all happens, right? So if you don't agree that that's possible, then you don't have to think about the rest of it. So ask yourself, what would this involve as a strategy? How would we know if it was working or failing? If you don't have these tests, then you don't have any sort of scientific basis in your papers. Also, a common issue with cyber policy papers. And what are the other pieces of modern tacit bargaining that might be implicated that we could start seeing as a framework, right? So these are the sorts of, this is the problem statement that we're trying to set for our understanding of this topic. And if you do a big survey of the literature, you're going to end up here. You're going to end up learning about focal points, Nash equilibriums, and I think we should talk about focal points first, which is, I've mentioned before, there's sort of they also call them Schelling points, after Thomas Schelling, which is a solution that people tend to choose by default in the absence of communication. So if your communication channel is very noisy or your communication channel is untrusted, that can count as an absence of communication. In many cases, we've cut off diplomatic relations and discussions with the Chinese and the Russians, and we've never even started with many other teams in terms of where we want cyber norms to be. So that counts as an absence of communication, right? So Schelling points obviously are very pertinent. If you go through the research, I wanted to call out these two authors, especially Catherine Langlois. I'm going to murder the pronunciation of that name. But so these are some papers that you're going to come across, I guess, from the Journal of Conflict Resolution, again, 1996. She has an array of papers that are all attempting to tie game theory to tacit bargaining and trying to pull it into the real world. So using real game theory math, right? Like, so we sort of define actors, let's say the Japanese car manufacturers and the American car manufacturers, and then Japanese government and the American government, and we're going to model how they interact, and what we're going to do is we're going to assign payoffs to different strategies and different outcomes, right? So, and we're trying to define, is there tacit agreement at different numbers to try to figure out if it happened, if tacit bargaining worked as a model. So I just want to put a little post. This is like a section from that paper, right? So we define a game, we look at a strategy. This is the theoretical math we're going to be using, and then we solve the equations, and then we see if we get what actually happened, right? So and then based on that, is tacit bargaining visible? There's a lot of these types of papers, and you'll see the literature is kind of full of them. I'm going to reserve some comment for that later. Again, another one from kind of the 50s and 60s, David Blackwell. You can find that you have to buy them. They're like $20 each, which is very annoying. I don't know how to get around that for everybody, but like, so looking at games where it's sort of like you don't have as much knowledge about the results of something, right? Which you'll see does come into play. And I want to really just like examine some broader theory here. And I think this is a weakness in a lot of international relations papers, is they haven't read biology papers for some reason. And so, like, if you don't understand that there's just a huge amount of work that's gone into understanding how plaque on your teeth gets created by bacteria that each should be fighting for themselves and not sacrificing to create a plaque. How do they do signaling? How do they do what's called quorum sensing is super important because it's a very similar problem. And they've been looking at game theory to try to model it, to try to understand it. Anyway, so you can find some really interesting work there. Again, linked below. Go read the papers. But then the reason I'm linking to this is because I don't think anyone in international relations has ever read these papers. So I think they think bacteria aren't important, which is very weird. Same problem, different. So our tools, like Schelling points, game theory, and then, asking around, I guess. I don't know what the other tools that you are using are to understand these problems. So let's talk a little bit. Here's one of the things in the book is they talked a lot about sort of the fractaline nature of the problem without directly implicating chaos theory, which is the study of what can't be known, in a sense, about a system. What is the limit to our knowledge, which is much more important when you're looking at, complicated problems with many actors than and unknown variables than simple game theory, right? So in some senses, I view them as diametrically opposed, right? Game theory, we have very simple systems that we know a lot about, and we're sort of playing out a strategy, and we're trying to solve for that strategy. In sort of chaos theory, you're like, well, I have a billion variables, and here's how far out my vision goes, and there's a limit. How do I calculate what that limit is? That's an important, I just want people to keep that in their mind when looking at, how does that filter up into tacit bargaining? I think that's an important thing. I want to talk a little bit about export control. And so what I'm trying to do here is explain why I think the number of variables in the systems we are modeling is far, far too small. And a recent Lawfare blog article came out where someone was like very upset. They were like, "Oh my gosh, 2020 Department of Commerce adapted these controls so that you can't send stuff to Huawei, but Seagate still sending stuff to Huawei. No one did anything about it. What happened? What happened here?" Right? And I don't know what happened, but I'm just going to guess this probably isn't the first time, right? Like, what are the reasons for this happening is more interesting than this is happening, right? So, and I want to highlight another article that came out recently where Microsoft, who we rely on for a lot of the Ukraine stuff, by the way, like Microsoft's not a small player when it comes to how we are doing a lot of things in cyberspace, was a little bit upset that they couldn't share information with the Chinese government. Again, the answer to this problem, like many problems, is going to be discretionary enforcement, right? Like, what's happening here? Discretionary enforcement. What's happening here? Oh, it's going to be discretionary enforcement, right? So why? Why and how? And all of these things start to broaden your picture of like how big your model needs to be. That's what I'm trying to point out. And I want to give you some scope for what the issue is here, right? Because everyone is modeling. What you are modeling when you do game theory is you're modeling payoff and penalties for winning and losing, and you're modeling who the actors are and what the scenarios are, right? So each of your actors has a small memory. They're like a tiny little bug with a tiny little memory, and they can only think so much, right? So a lot of these things, actually, they kind of crack me up. But I'm trying to say is those models are fairly inaccurate to the real world and what we really see here, and never will be accurate. They never will be. All that math that you're seeing about tacit bargaining, wasted math. Let's just put it that way. Gets you in the literature for sure, 100%. Gets you tenure, yes, 100%. Impossible to peer review, also true. Wasted though, wasted. Anyway, so let's say you're a small company. A tiny little company, you make radio receivers, but because of export control rules, you're not allowed to sell any of your most modern SDR, radio receivers to China. But over the last 10 years, most of your customers have migrated, most of your US customers have migrated to all your modern equipment. So you have like an older set of equipment that you're allowed to sell outside, like not to China, but like out into Europe and whatnot. And then you have your modern stuff, and your modern stuff is for the US market, right? So if China comes in, hacks your stuff, steals you blind, because you have like one security person and, they happen to be on vacation that day, which is pretty normal for a lot of these smaller companies. they steal you blind, you don't react in time or whatever, and then eventually you react, you kick them out. It's fine. But they steal information related to your older equipment. So they don't have your latest equipment, but they have your older stuff, which is honestly pretty much almost the same quality. Does this have a material effect on your business? No, not really. Not really, because you're making your money off the new stuff, and the European market's not that big for you, to be honest, and it costs you a lot in support and marketing and sales costs, and it's not that big a deal to you. So if they start producing and selling it overseas, yeah, you're taking a teeny hit, but it's not like a huge hit. You're fine with it realistically. And if at the same time they lock out Russian ransomware hackers, then they've actually moved from like a parasite to a symbiote, right? So now you have a benefit from them hacking you. They're taking some of your business in Europe eventually, but you don't have to worry about getting hacked by the Russians. So that's not bad. And they don't have to do this on purpose. This could be a side effect of what the Chinese hackers are doing to you, right? So it's just a scenario. Just pretend this happened, maybe. Who knows? In fact, if they start up a factory and they start producing older parts, now you might have an ability to support customers that you never could have supported before, because they're going to do the Chinese market. So now you can buy those parts from China and support your European customers. That's fantastic. And so I just want to give you an example of how the motivations, even for scenarios that seem really detrimental to a particular company, can actually not be that detrimental, right? So why is it that motivations between a company and a government are really misaligned most of the time? And I think that's a new feature for a lot of this stuff, is that, when you look at a lot of the original papers and they're analyzing, Honda's, building, factories in the United States up to a certain point. Why are they doing that, right? So a lot of those are assuming like Honda's they're a Japanese company, and, Chevrolet is an American company, but these things get really mixed up and the motivations are really complicated. They're not simple motivations in cyber at all. So, are you modeling those correctly? What can't you model is the important question that I want you to ask. Signals, counter signals, right? So you have two parties even in a very simple model. What are the signals like? It's very difficult to model intent. A lot of the cyber policy world assumes that attribution is a solved problem, which I find very funny. Let's go into this. So this was J.D. Work's paper, I think, explained a lot of different things in terms of how are the signals going to be received and how does it all work out in real life, right? So looking at intrusions against an Iranian railway network, did anyone even understand what they were looking at? And the answer was no. There were very few papers written about this. Very surprising. So even when the signal is very clear, no one was listening. So this was another example. Signal not received very well. We don't know if it's part of a big attack. We don't, So I guess my point here is, if you have something like a cyber attack that knocks thousands of people offline in Europe, is that an attack against Europe? And then there's just a lot of bloviate. Like, people are like, we don't know. We're guessing. We are guessing. Right? So that's not a good sign for tacit bargaining when you are guessing at the signals, when you're not receiving signals properly. Tacit bargaining is strongest when actions carry clear signals. That's I assume, reflected in the literature. I don't actually know, to be honest. I didn't see a whole lot of discussion about how clear signals were versus how unclear signals were in real life. Okay, and many countries that we're talking about do not have the ability to attribute or do incident response properly. And I think when we say many, what we really mean is all. Even the United States does not have the amount of incident responders it would need to both handle current incident response demands and analyze the results of the incident responses to properly determine what signals you are receiving from some sort of action that another adversary was doing, which is essential to the principle of tacit bargaining. So if you can't send signals via actions, you cannot do tacit bargaining the way you need to. And I guess my theory here is, I don't want to put numbers on it, but very poor visibility into the specifics of actions, even in a best case scenario, right? So telemetry is not necessarily directly visible to the governments. Here in the United States, we now have mandatory reporting. And you also have, like, CISA begging for, please tell us about incidents, right? Just how do we put the big picture together if you can't tell us? We can't help you, but also we can't put the bigger pictures together to help you on a strategic basis, right? So, what happens when the telemetry isn't even in private hands that are friendly to you? Like, it's a different company, it's a different country, right? So, like, if you're in Germany, are you receiving tacit bargaining with Russia? But you're being protected by CrowdStrike, right? So I don't know. So the effort to understand is different from the effort to discover, and that's a problem. You have to have extremely thorough, analysis methodology. Like, you have to understand what finished intel is supposed to look like. And this is a world where people are conducting false flag operations. You may remember from one of the previous talks, GCHQ also got this wrong. You can attribute incorrectly. So even when it is feasible to determine a signal coming from another actor, it may be a very slow signal. So in game theory, I would take a turn, and I wouldn't know if I'd paid the penalty for 15 turns, right? So that's a really hard thing to model. Just looking at the delay, is norm creation possible via tacit understanding when there's this much delay and this much noise in the system? So this is the hardest part of some of this work, is asking, can you create norms or any kind of agreement when everything is this confused? And in fact, you have a mix. You have a mix of actors. You have a mix of motivations. You have confused signals that happen over a long period of time, even though actions can happen very quickly. That's the question, is, like, at what point is there so much noise in the system that the boundary of what cannot be known is close to your nose, right? So that's a key part of this. Okay, so also, human resources problems. We have to talk about this. Norms aren't going to be doing what happened with nuclear, right? With nuclear, and even with bio and chem and stuff like this, you get sort of like the top 7 countries can enter the world, and then they dictate it to everybody else, and they've already established norms. There's a sort of like creation, maybe a little primordial creation period of the norms, and then they kind of dictate it down to everybody as they enter the system. And people enter the system quite slowly. That's not going to happen in cyber. All of a sudden, you're going to start seeing people talk about, Egypt, Sudan, Taiwan, Vietnam, and like 100 other countries as essentially players in this world at the top level. And you're going to be like, oh, how did this all happen? Norms aren't ready yet. They're not baked, right? So, but most countries don't have a diplomatic team or a policy team that can understand the tacit bargaining. Like, I think Microsoft has a better team for understanding tacit bargaining and projecting what their versions of the norms are than almost every other country. So how is it possible in that kind of space that you get tacit bargaining? So these are all questions. These are questions I have. I also think disintermediation means that confusion at the top level is going to be highly disruptive to any kind of agreement forming. I don't want to call out any U.S. presidents, but like a lot of them have been like, yeah, I don't believe the attribution that the rest of the community believes, right? So that's highly disruptive behavior to norm creation, shall we say, and agreement creation. And again, you have non-state actors on offense and defense, right? So it's not just one-sided. The model is very mixed up. I just wanted to highlight this section here where Admiral Rogers was talking a little bit about, he was, I think doing a Senate testimony, So warfare in and through cyberspace is typically conceptualized as state-on-state or state-on-non-state action, equivalent to an armed attack or the use of force in cyberspace. What we're looking at here is a Schelling point. We are looking at this idea that if the state-on-state activity through cyberspace is not equivalent to an armed attack, that it's not essentially going to count. Right? So this is the Schelling point people have found. They don't like it. They don't like it. People want there to be boundaries within cyberspace. I had a former government official call me up the other day and talk to me for like 2 hours about how upset they were about the fact that people are still hacking hospitals. I get it. People are upset about that. But the Schelling point's not there. So anyway, these are all the things. These are more questions than answers as we start to examine these systems. And I want to apply the theory a little bit to get some clarity on Schelling points and what a focal point really looks like and what we've tried to do that hasn't worked. And I'm going to say the Tallinn manuals are an attempt. There's an aspect of Schelling's theory about tacit bargaining where he talks about how sometimes the Schelling point is not determined immediately. So sometimes you say, look, our price is going to be $15, but it's going to go up every year according to the current interest rate of the Fed. And that is still a Schelling point, right? You can agree on something that has a variable, essentially. And the Tallinn manual and international law in this space is an attempt at doing exactly that, right? So they're like, look, we're not saying that you have to agree with a bunch of crazy stuff. What we're saying is you just have to say that you agree with international law in cyber, and then we'll add some specifics in the international law documents that we've all kind of like thought over a little bit. So we're kind of like saying, do you agree with international law? Because that's essentially a Schelling point. And then we'll specify it later. It's cool. It's cool. And we can change the specification as we need to, but everyone's going to ascribe to the Tallinn manual specification of it because we've already agreed. So this is, and you're starting to see this, and here's the problem with that, is that you have to have some real concreteness to it to generate a Schelling point that way, right? So people are very willing to say we follow international law because they're willing to interpret international law however they want, and in general agree to the principles without, truly agreeing to everything in the Tallinn manual. So, if we were to draw some much more simpler focal points of norms, no hacking of healthcare or hospitals, we know that that's not a Schelling point. No hacking of election systems or other similar systems that violate sovereignty. Doesn't seem to be a Schelling point. No cyber physical operations. No, it seems to be something people still do, right? So if you had to guess, like, you could draw like 100 of these and try to analyze each one. You could write an international law paper and maybe an international relations paper on various, are these potentially norms that you would like? And Microsoft has probably done this for you, right? They're like, no, what about no hacking Microsoft, like supply chain people, like important software companies, right? Like, that's something that people have proposed, right? And tried to create a norm around. I don't think you're going to get it. And I don't think you're going to get any of these because of what we talked about in the previous set of slides with the complications, right? So the signals are confused, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to return again to this where it's sort of, when you see a norm work is when you see NATO saying at a big stage that, we are going to treat cyber attacks as if they are other attacks under Article 5, right? So what is the norm here? Well, we will issue military responses if we see what we think of military attacks, right? Like, that makes complete sense. But that's not the granularity of the norms people really want to talk about with tacit bargaining in cyber. So I want to look at game theory. There's a really great talk, actually from Thomas Schelling, I think it's in the 90s or early 2000s, Thomas Schelling's passed now, but this is like, I think it's the last talk he gave on YouTube. You can just watch it. And what he talks about is that the prisoner's dilemma, first of all, is not a dilemma. Second of all, tacit bargaining doesn't work for it. Right? He's like, didn't anyone notice that there's like tacit bargaining is not the solution? And he seems a little annoyed by that. But anyway, so it's not always the answer. Game theory is not always the answer. And, you know, you get this big issue where diplomacy can happen at a much more granular level than state to state. You know, like in these cases, the motivations of segments of one of the actors are different from the motivations of the actor as a whole. That makes game theory very hard. The harder the game theory is, the less likely it is that you're going to get a good result out of game theory that applies to the real world, is unfortunately true. And if we just go through and list like some of the actors and their different, like, can you imagine trying to run a game theory process on this many actors and all these variables? Like even the last one, like governments that change their entire team every 4 years. Is that something you could tacitly bargain with? What if the time frame to understand any particular attack is 3 years? See what I'm saying? Like that's going to make your life really hard. We had to kick Huawei, I believe, out of first. We kicked Kaspersky out of first. Right? So if you're not familiar with FIRST, it's like the big international incident response. You know, you can call them white hats, right? So they had to kick Kaspersky out. I don't know who else is in there. But like, if you had to kick someone out of FIRST, it's a really weird sign. It's a really weird sign because it implies that there's other people within FIRST whose motivations are not aligned with FIRST necessarily. Offensive vendors do get a play here, and so does researchers. So does the open source community, right? Like the open source community has motivations that are not necessarily aligned with a big software vendor or a big country or their country. It's very like what I'm saying is the problem's too complex for game theory to be a tool, and the problem's too complex for Schelling points to be a tool. So what are the tools you're going to use when you want to understand tacit bargaining and cyber? And if you don't understand it, how are you going to influence it? And how are you going to create norms? That is the question that I'm trying to ask you to ask. How do you measure success? How do I say that a norm has been created? How do I detect temporary norms that then disappear as the system evolves? Right? Like people don't want to talk about norms as an evolving system. But you definitely will get temporary minima and temporary maxima, and then these will dissipate, right? So that's a real thing. How do I measure any of this stuff? Especially, people were very excited. After the Obama-Xi summit, people were very excited. Like this, they're like, this is the creation of a norm. There were a few people, and like me, who were like, this didn't happen, right? Like, stop being so excited and putting it on your CV and like, we're great now. That's actually an example of explicit bargaining. But nonetheless, how do you measure what is a very temporary success? Right? So, and in fact, that's an exact example that the authors of that paper use. They're like, explicit bargaining has been failing for decades now. But at the time, if you were there, at the time, people were very excited. It was a big accomplishment. Okay. In conclusion, it is possible that barriers to explicit bargaining are totally real in cyberspace. We have seen this. We have seen that explicit bargaining is not effective. And it's also possible that barriers to tacit bargaining are real. And I think we should examine whether or not tacit bargaining is effective in cyberspace as a separate problem. And not assume that just because explicit bargaining doesn't work, that tacit bargaining is the way to go, necessarily. And I will say the Schelling point may be something, by definition, it has to be very simple. The Talon document there are thousands of pages of confusion. And I compare it to the Talmud because that's kind of the only valid comparison. And it's by definition not a Schelling point. Schelling theory of a bargaining peg to a standard is it just might not work here, right? We may never get a standard document that explains how responsible behavior in cyberspace is going to work. And it's only going to get more and more chaotic as more players enter the field, which is happening every day. Explicit bargaining, I think, is a proven dead end. I don't think the game theory work that's being done is very useful at all. I think it defines binaries. Game theory is great with binaries. It's like in a nuclear war, a lot of people with the nuclear game theory like would ascribe like -1,000 to the weight of the benefit, and I'm like, like these are binaries. You have a 1 or a 0. The same thing's kind of true with a lot of the conventional war game theory papers. If you read through them, war either happened or it didn't, and the results of war are terrible. So it's sort of like it's a little bit of a binary effect. The answer to looking at some of these things in detail is you may get no norms that are intra-cyberspace. You may not get norms. Why can't we be okay with that? And I think the answer is that we want them. We want them, so we must have them. And that's the difference between theory and hopes and dreams. You know what I'm saying? So I would like us to take a little bit more of, dare I say it, a realist approach to some of this. That's my international relations joke of the day. All right, so what does this proposed understanding in this paper, in this talk that you are listening to right now, what does this proposed understanding tell you? One, I'm going to stand up and say we're not going to get norms because the Schelling point has already been, I think, stated. And one of the key, all right, so here's one of the reasons you see a lot of discussion about norms, is one of the key features in Schelling's theory is that the first person to state a stance is often the winner, because they're saying, I would agree to $50. And then the rest of it's negotiation on the $50, right? So that's a key theory of, argument theory, whatever. That's why you hear all these people saying, no hacking hospitals, no hacking critical infrastructure, no hacking this, no hacking that, blah, blah, blah. Get off the no hacking train, because that's not going to happen, right? So, but I think what we're going to see is more of a hyper-balkanized network, right? So you're starting to see that. I think we're going to see that all of this analysis is frankly impossible without handling non-state actors as first-party players. So that's going to involve a major revision in a lot of the international relations work. We're not good at that. Let's put it that way. Is there another kind of bargaining? I think we need to find one. I pointed at a paper that I wrote on technically substantiated bargaining, which is, and confidence building, which is essentially trying to put a hybrid type of bargaining together. So you have tacit bargaining, you got explicit bargaining, and you got something else. What is that thing? I think those are open questions. Instead of doing game theory and doing it, I'll be honest, in a pretty confusing way, what if we just do massive computer simulations? We have AI. We're not using AI. We have graph databases and link prediction and all sorts of modern features that we can do that can sort of examine where payoffs really are. Looking for payoff weights, maybe an AI would be better at that than our game theory math, right? So again, you're saying, well, we don't want to use that because we can't introspect into it and figure out if it's right, what it's doing inside. That's true for the math as well, let's be honest. And then instead of doing, people do tabletop games a lot, and I think let's just do video games. Do a big MMORPG, and, when your video game reflects the real world enough, you're going to start getting results that resemble the real world. Maybe that can tell us something very useful. So what other tools can we produce that that can take sort of the world of cyber, understanding initiative persistence, and be able to predict things? Let's just start with predicting. The other option is, honestly, it's just smart people thinking about stuff. I don't think that is a replicable great way to scale up thinking about initiative persistence. And if you agree with the book, which I happen to, that initiative persistence is the way to think about this, then these are the sorts of questions you're starting to ask. So I have another talk coming out after this, and it's about looking at initiative persistence and persistent engagement in terms of a more tactical approach. What does it really involve, aside from defend forward, which I don't think is as big a piece of it as other people are saying or projecting, because they have to. So I have another talk coming up after this, but I wanted to start introducing, honestly, some of my own thoughts into this analysis and trying to figure out where the gaps are in general with the research. So it's an exciting time. If you like this video, if you are, for example, writing the Chinese review of initiative persistence and persistent engagement, then feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments, anonymously or whatever you want to do. But yeah, I think this is important stuff. Otherwise, I wouldn't put this kind of time into it. I feel like we can't take great theories and then necessarily not analyze them in depth, because you end up with weaker theories that way. So, okay. Hopefully you like this talk. There's going to be one more after this on this subject, and then we're moving on to other things. I get a lot of responses from international relations students and professors and international law students and professors. So if you explicitly think that I missed a paper, let me know. I read a bunch of papers for this talk, but there's always another one. It's your paper, I'm sure. So, all right, thank you so much, and I'll see you guys soon.